Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Before we proceed with our next panel discussion, I would like to ask all of you for a minute of silence in solidarity with the victims in Novi Sad. Thank you, everyone. We will continue now with our panel discussion, Public Assembly Under Threat, Safeguarding Civic Engagement. This important session will feature the following distinguished panelists. Clément Voule, former United Nations Special Rapporteur on the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and of association. Jelena Sesar, researcher at Amnesty International. Milena Vasić, lawyer and program director, Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, YUCOM, and Sofija Todorović, director of Youth Initiative for Human Rights. This discussion will be moderated by Jovana Spremo, advocacy director, Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, YUCOM. Enjoy the panel.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending the panel, Public Assembly Under the Threat, what we can do about safeguarding civic engagement worldwide. I think that the topic is quite timely, especially when we look at it from the Serbian perspective, where we are holding the conference, having in mind that only today we have had 3 different assemblies which have been treated in a way that is not so according to the laws that our country has, including those in Novi Sad and Belgrade. So I think there's no better day to discuss. If we cannot join people in the street, there is not a better day to discuss these issues than today. So when we are speaking of the changing environment for exercising the freedom of assembly, we have to look at a few late years behind us, and we can see that more and more people are trying to actually join this global struggle to defend the justice in the streets. So from the protests against war crimes in Gaza, in the American campuses, to agricultural protests throughout Europe, especially in France and Germany, and different kind of protests that we also saw in the previous movies, where people actually seek election rights, which they did not maybe receive in the sole processes that they had. And there are several factors which furthermore disable the people to protect their right to freedom of assembly. And this is mainly the limited media freedoms that we had, shrinking space for the freedom of expression also, and also strong propaganda and different kind of lobbies that are striving to present the protesters as they are doing something wrong by being in the street and demanding for different kind of things. And we actually have to be there to explain that this political right has to be defended not only by the activists themselves, but by all the citizens and all relevant stakeholders, including the governments in the countries worldwide. So for over the years, UN has developed different kind of not only the international standards, but also the tools on how to protect the people protesting in the streets, and what do the countries have to do in order to enhance their capabilities, especially of the institutions who are in charge of securing these kind of assemblies, to actually be there for the citizens in the streets. Today we basically want to explore the strategies and mechanisms that can be employed to safeguard this right. And especially in this phase where we are sort of just looking for different kind of restrictions of this right and not being able to actually say that it is fully respected in all the areas of the world. I always like to mention that when we look at the country report of the European Commission for Serbia, 3 years ago, we would have only one sentence regarding the freedom of assembly, which would be the alignment of the law with the missing parts that we had. And for the last 3 years, we have had even an excessive page in the report, which we all know that is very limited with words, explaining what was done wrong towards the people protesting. I have a pleasure to have great panelists today. They were already introduced, but I will try to direct the questions towards you regarding your expertise and your past careers. So today with us is Mr. Clément Voule, who is a former UN Special Rapporteur on rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and association, which always go hand in hand, I guess. So I would like to ask you, given your extensive experience in your previous position and your excessive work on the international standards, what kind of challenges do you see worldwide, especially when it comes to the aligning of this local legislation towards the international standards, and how do you see these recent practices of policing assemblies worldwide?
Thank you very much, Jovana. And first of all, allow me to greet all of you that are joining us for this panel. And I always say that when we have possibility to discuss about these fundamental freedoms, it is always important to kind of look at them as something that is part of our own struggle as human beings throughout history. There is no country today that can say that they have been able to gain their freedom without the struggle, without people joining, going on the street, protesting, expressing their view, women, children, laborers, all of these things that we gain today, thanks to the right to freedom of peaceful assembly, and one of the components, which is the peaceful protest. And as you mentioned, under the international standard, in particular, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Article 21 protects this fundamental freedom for everyone without any discrimination. We all have the rights to protest. We have the right to peaceful protest, peaceful assembly, protest being the components, the main one, the main tools, or the main means that is used to express these fundamental freedoms. And we know that the guarantee of these rights is important for human beings, in particular for marginalized group, for all of us, because it's thanks to the right to assembly that we are able to join hands together, to be able also to voice our concern, to participate on the public affair, to be able also, as a citizen from a country, to mitigate and resolve our own differences. When, for example, you are a marginalized group, or you are women, and your rights, and you are struggling with challenges, the way that you can also communicate those challenges to the communities is also to be able also to come on the streets, to call everybody to join you, to be able to express and to express your grievance. So this right is a foundation that allows citizens to construct their own democracy and the way that they can participate to the public affair. So it is fundamental. And we also know that in a country where there are constant attacks against the right to assembly, there are constant measures limiting the exercise of these rights. We know also that in this country, what we witness is the backsliding of democracy and civic participation, because there is no more avenue, democratic avenue for citizens to be able to convene their grievances, to the leader in order for them to take it in account in developing or adopting the better policy that can help states to move forward. But we agree, you asked me about this standard, we agree at the international level that the covenant itself puts some limits. This right is not absolute. The covenant defines some of the ground in which states can resort to some limitation of this fundamental freedom. And those grounds including, for example, national security, it also includes public order, it also includes public moral, and the protection of the right to others. But also the covenant also clearly says that when resorting to these limitations, states must ensure that those limitations are necessary in a democratic society and proportionate to the threats that trigger these limitations. However, we are seeing around the world today, in particular, I may say in the recent 10 years, but these two years was really, really very difficult for this fundamental right. We are seeing also that under the pretext, for example, of fights against terrorism, national security, some states resort to the adoption of draconian legislation, requesting, for example, the organizer to first obtain the permit for the protest. While we know that peaceful protest is fundamental freedoms, what we need is that states need just to put measures in place to help people to exercise these rights in a peaceful way, in a conducive environment. But we are seeing that under this terrorism law, people now states put some restriction. Some of the law, for example, do not even make a difference between those who are exercising these rights as an avenue to improve the society, the community, than those who also are triggered by intention of maybe harming the society. Terrorists, and I used to say that, and within my mandate, that is wrong always for the state to associate human rights defenders, social movement group, with a group of the terrorists, because it's completely in contradiction with these fundamental freedoms. But also, we have also seen the way that some of the states, under the pretext also of protecting national economy, development, that those states also stigmatize those who are fighting for climate change, for climate justice. And we know that today, one way that we have been able to improve the international policy, to raise concern about the global warming, is when the youth, women, are on the streets, reminding states about their obligation to ensure that our planet do not disappear in few years. But however, we saw that in many, now the leadership now today is more prioritizing economic interests, corporate interests over the climate. And we have seen in some countries, for example, where climate justice activism was also stigmatized and was also qualified as eco-terrorist, and also faced prosecution. And sometimes also criminal charges, where in some cases also for only hanging yourself or attaching yourself on a bridge, you will face 20 years, you will face also some charges that are completely disproportionate. However, we know that the covenant also reminds that in any type of delimitation, you need also to make sure that there is a proportionality. And also we have another aspect that is important I want to also to raise, is also the discriminatory laws or discriminatory implementation of laws that we are seeing. We know that the covenants say that states might resort to the restrictions to protect public morale. But we are also seeing that this is used as an argument, for example, to limit the exercise of this right when it comes to the, for example, LGBT rights, minority rights, women's rights, abortion issue. We know that there is a double standard and there is a discriminatory application of the law. But however, it's important to remind again that the limitation in relation to the public moral should be justified, and it has to be justified, and it has also to be clearly laid down how this restriction can protect the cohesion and they can protect the exercise of fundamental rights. You cannot just say that in our society we don't believe or we don't accept these rights, then you limit, you ask the organizer to not organize a protest for the defense of LGBT rights or defense of abortion or whatever. So it is important to remind that. But also, another thing that I want also to highlight here is about also new emerging issues that we are also seeing today on the digital platform, where, for example, I know some of my colleagues will talk about that, but also some of the restriction, because digital age today provide opportunity for citizens to be able to mobilize and to come together on the street to be able to protest. And we know that most of the protests are organized now online, and they have their component on physical, but online is now a space where we organize a lot of protests. COVID-19 is there to show us. But at the same time, there is so much infiltration in terms of surveillance on online, in terms of states equipping themselves. Online, now protesters are even arrested before even coming to the protest time, and which is worrying. And throughout my 6 years as a mandate holder, I was always warning states about the fact that the peaceful protests and these fundamental rights should be protected as an avenue of building democracy, peaceful society, but also as an avenue given to the citizen to be able also to convey their message whenever they are not happy. Because in a society where there is a lack of democratic means, like a peaceful protest for society, for marginalized group, then you are not giving them any possibility than maybe to choose other alternative that is not democratic alternative. And it is important to remind that. And I would like also to say, I hear that it is this undue restriction that we are seeing around the world. And today we should be really worried about that. Because what is happening today is that because of some of these restrictions, the restriction of the right to peaceful assembly, but also right to association and expression also, are part of what we are seeing now as a global trend that undermines democracy. It undermines our ability to live in society as a citizen, and our ability also to be able to contribute, to face or to contribute to deal with some of the challenges that we are seeing around the world. Today, in relation to the conflict, in relation to deep inequality, we are seeing today that war are around us, inequality are increasing, authoritarian regimes are emerging. What else can we protect as this fundamental freedom for citizens to be able every time to defend democracy? When people are not able to protest anymore, they cannot voice their concern anymore, then democracy is not protected. Then we leave democracy, we leave the participation in the hand of those authoritarian people or authoritarian regime that want to impose the silence. That's how we need to connect that, the decline of or the restriction of these rights with what we are seeing today around the world in this emerging democracy. And also, and to end that, I want also to convey to you to say today that these are the global trends. We need to be aware, and we need also to remind ourselves that the freedom that we are enjoying today is because some people were able to enjoy the right to protest. That's why they were able to build democracy for us. And we should not leave our society, we should not live for the future generation, a society where no one is able to talk, no one is able to express their grievance. And I always say this to the all states. The right to assembly, peaceful protest, is not a threat. Peaceful protest is a means for people to express their convey. What is the threat really is when the state reacts wrongly. When law enforcement reacts brutality, suppress the protest. This is how you create insecurity and you create incentive for people, for citizens, to go for means that are not democratic. So just to conclude, to say also that today there are the challenge that I'm seeing in relation to really some country applying some of these law and standard is the fact that many countries today, because of the social concerns that are emerging, are not able to deal with those social concerns. And the way that some of these countries are acting is to restrict these fundamental rights. Because either they don't have arguments or they are lacking some possibility or they are lacking expertise to be able to deal with social concern. And this is in contradiction with what is the peaceful assembly, because peaceful assembly is an avenue to discuss, is the way that governments and citizens can discuss and can come can agree on how to develop and how to build a common future.
Thank you. And maybe that lack of the communication between the citizens and the government is actually leading to governments being afraid by the masses in the streets. And I would like to turn to Ms. Sesar, and you have been working on the report on freedom of assembly for a while now, and it's about to be published. So my question is to make it a bit narrow now. What are the trends in Europe, and maybe specifically in the region of Western Balkans, which you have noted, and how do you perceive the situation in this changing time that we mentioned already?
Thank you, Milena. So basically, we are about to publish a report that specifically deals with Serbia sometime in December. But over the summer, we put out a huge report that covers 21 countries in Europe, including 2 countries in the region, Serbia and Slovenia. The report was really 2 years in the making. It included quite a complex methodology of like 200 questions, covering both legal and issues in practice, and highlights some of the examples that helped us put together sort of a global picture on the state of the right to protest and peaceful assembly in Europe. And I would say, as Clément mentioned, the situation is quite dire. What we found is a continent-wide pattern of repressive laws, excessive use of force, discriminatory laws, arbitrary charges and arrests, and increasing use of very invasive digital surveillance to monitor and control activists, human rights defenders, and protesters in general. So I'll maybe speak with some of these trends, and you have already mentioned some of them, but I will maybe highlight them also based on some of our conclusions. So while the right to protest is almost universally codified in all of these countries in Europe, both in constitution, in secondary laws, it is clear that almost nowhere do they meet the highest international human rights law and standard. And not only that, what we have seen over the past few years is introduction of increasingly more repressive legislation. In part, legislation that has introduced new restrictions, for instance, on the time and place of gathering. I think you have something like that in Serbia as well. We have situations where countries have introduced restrictions and introduced new charges. For instance, in the UK, something that was perfectly normal over the past 20, 30 years, which is blockade of highways, for instance, which was only a misdemeanor up until recently, is now a criminal offense, which is punishable with up to 6 months in prison. We have also seen much stricter penalties for the protesters and quite significant liabilities and responsibilities for organizers, including obligations to organize security, cover cost of security, and similar. And all along with these changes to the legislation, we have also seen quite sharpened and incredibly hostile rhetoric coming mostly from the authorities, senior public officials, and this stigmatization and name-calling of protesters being labeled as, I don't know, eco-terrorists, traitors, lunatics in some countries and similar. Basically, what is happening is that something that has traditionally been perceived as a right to protest, is suddenly seen as a privilege that can be easily taken away, and also seen as a threat by some of the authorities that need to be actually countered. And I think all this has also led to authorities increasingly justifying more and more restrictions being placed on some of the protests. Also, discrimination is something that is quite an interesting phenomenon, especially over the past 2 years, I would say. Anti-discrimination commitment is enshrined in, again, both constitution and legislation of most of the countries. Yet what we have seen is an incredible crackdown on only certain types of protests. So something that was maybe not as prevalent here in the region, but was a huge issue in Western Europe, are the Palestinian solidarity protests. We have had some restrictions, but definitely not to the degree that we have seen in most Western European countries, where authorities have outright placed bans on these gatherings, banned certain chants, certain outfits, and similar. And obviously, in some countries, we have seen quite a violent crackdown of these, specifically targeting these protests. But it's not only the pro-Palestinian protests that have been targeted. Obviously, we have a situation where climate activists, women's groups, and groups basically speaking on gender justice as well are equally targeted in some of the countries, particularly here in the region. And then something that we are witnessing even here today, over-policing. In most of the countries that we have covered have very clear laws governing the use of force by law enforcement agencies, and they always tend to reflect, at least in theory, the principles of necessity and proportionality. But very few countries actually have separate legislation and regulations speaking to specifically the use of force and behavior of law enforcement in the context of protests. And I have to say that, shockingly, Serbia is an outlier here, because Serbian law on interior actually includes quite specific regulations on use of less lethal weapons. Unfortunately, they're not adequate because the thresholds for use of each weapon is not clearly articulated. The risks of some of the individual less lethal weapons is not also clearly articulated, so they're not adequate, but at least it's a good starting point, and it's something that we would really like to see a lot more, and I know that you might be speaking a little bit about that later as well. In addition to that, we obviously, out of all the 21 countries that we have covered, every single one has had examples of excessive use of force or disproportionate use of force. Sometimes even resulting in permanent injuries to protesters and even journalists who were covering some of these protests. Apart from that, police has overused the right to disperse protests, oftentimes only because small groups within otherwise completely peaceful protests were behaving violently, and instead of targeting just that specific group and neutralizing them, they would often move to disperse the entire or ban the entire protest. And then we have something that we have been very concerned about in Serbia, which is the use of extremely serious criminal charges against protesters, and I would say that over the past 6 months in particular, we have noted the overuse of this charge of attempts to violently overthrow constitutional order. This is quite a serious charge that carries penalty up to 8 years of imprisonment, yet people who have been charged with it are often just either people who were either merely participating in these protests, or they put a post on social media either calling for these protests, sometimes not even that, sometimes literally just reposting or liking somebody else's post. So obviously this, on the pretext of very serious charges, we have a series of other human rights violations taking place in addition to this. And then maybe if I can just end with the emerging trend. I mean, we keep saying emerging, but it's been now a few years that we're seeing an incredible level of digital violence and digital surveillance against protesters and anybody participating in peaceful protests. This is truly a huge issue because many European countries, Netherlands is one of them that is pioneering almost all the equipment and new technologies, including biometric surveillance, body-worn cameras, drones, and similar. In Serbia, we are currently documenting cases of increasing digital surveillance of people's phones and computers, or even social media accounts. And this is quite troubling because this kind of behavior constitutes very targeted, potentially mass surveillance, with huge amount of personal data of activists and protesters being processed, collected, stored, and possibly without any safeguards. We have also documented a situation here in Serbia where, at the pretext of these very serious criminal charges, authorities have temporarily seized phones and computers of the protesters and then subjected them to quite invasive digital forensic technology investigations. And again, all of this based on nothing more than often just a post on social media. So interestingly, while, I mean, this is quite a problem because in this case, it's not only that people's right to freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of expression and association are undermined, but also their right to privacy. And while the new technologies are becoming increasingly more advanced, the legislation in most of these countries is lagging behind quite severely, and the governments are continuing to use very general provisions in their criminal procedure codes and other relevant laws to justify the use of this technology. So just in conclusion, obviously it's quite a depressing picture, but it's also not lost, this whole irony is not lost, I think, on any of us in the panel today, that we have 3 ongoing protests taking place in Serbia, and the crackdown against civil society is happening in real time while we're here speaking.
Yes, and I'm very interested in how all these findings actually reflect on what is going on in this country, and we are, trust me, we are not happy to be pioneers in these malpractices. But I would like to actually turn to my colleague Milena, and who is attorney at law, and you have been representing human rights defenders, especially for the breaches of freedom of expression and freedom of assembly during the last decade, basically. So, and we have been speaking a lot about this different treatment of different actors and the discriminatory practices when it comes to treating protesters, but I would like to hear more about the cases that you would like to extract as an examples of what is going on with the freedom of assembly currently in Serbia, and you can also, if you like, touch upon the current happenings that we are looking now.
Yeah, thank you, Jovana. Today is not the brightest day for the freedom of assembly in Serbia, so I'll try to be as I try not to be as depressive as it sounds. Yeah, we have, Jovana mentioned, we had 3 protests today. Excessive use of force on 2 of the protests and arrest on the 3rd one. And the situation when it comes to freedom of assembly, but also freedom of expression and association, is extremely deteriorating. It is really hard to make a full story for such a short time, but I can say we have in the last 4 years, we have very often excessive use of force, criminal charges, as Jelena mentioned, serious criminal charges. We even had an attempt to put a new criminal deed in our criminal code, which would sanction giving advice and sharing advice on how to commit a criminal act, which was directly connected with protest and calling upon a violent change of constitutional order, as we read it, as activists read it, because it was not precise enough. So we also have intimidation of activists, massive surveillance, and what is really important, we had arrests, actually calling to informative conversation of activists, mostly because of their posts on social networks. So they didn't have to do nothing. They were administrators of some pages, and they were identified as organizers and called as suspects for the criminal deed, which is called calling for a violent change of constitutional order. What I want to say is that we are witnessing really hard pressure to freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, and in these conditions, the law which we criticized is not even the biggest problem. The law is not so bad as its implementation is. We have a problem with definition of spontaneous gathering as gathering without an organizer, which we all know it is impossible to have a gathering without organizers. So police uses social networks to identify organizers, and then they are charging them in misdemeanor proceeding for organizing unreported event, unimportant assembly. Luckily, we had some good court practice in misdemeanor court, and we had some judges who were willing to interpret the law in line with international standards and in line with the letter of that law, because the law specifies who is organizer of an assembly. But also we had before that a lot of activists paying really high fines for allegedly organizing unreported event. So yeah, we have a lot of different kind of pressures to freedom of assembly and activists, and we have to fight back. We are giving our best with providing free legal aid and providing information to activists and citizens who are still willing to protest. But what is, I think, really concerning is today's statement of Minister of Interior, which I have to mention, because it was kind of a threat to activists with even more excessive use of police force, because he said when you take out police baton, you don't put it away. So actually that means if you try any conflict with police, they will not stop. And that is directly against all international standards with proportionate use of police force. And when you have something like that being stated by the state official who is in charge of public order and policing public assemblies, what you should expect. And that is something which is yet going to be a topic of the more and more protests we are expecting because of crisis we have right now in our public space. And I will stop here so we can, I leave some space for Sofija.
Thank you, Milena. And I would also add that when you have a national mechanism for protection of human rights very inactive in this kind of situation, it gets even worse. And this is something that we have seen in December this year also, when we had the excessive use of force towards the citizens. We still did not have any kind of concludings by the ombudsperson, which we called to investigate further. And we hear that the similar statements are given also regarding this today and during the last 2 weeks. But I would like to turn to the personal experience now.
The pioneer of the band.
Yes, and Sofija Todorović, as a long-year activist of Youth Initiative for Human Rights, have tested and tested the rights to freedom of assembly, sometimes successfully, sometimes not so successfully. And this year we had an official ban of the Mirdita Dobar Dan festival, who has been happening for a decade now, if I'm not mistaken. To go back to this trend that we maybe don't have now, which is the pro-Palestinian protests, but we have been facing with different kind of bans and threats towards the protests, which have to do with dealing with the past, and also different kind of assemblies that appear to be organized in order to deal with the past. So how did you perceive the handling of the official authorities with a specific case, and maybe in general towards your practice?
I will start maybe by referring to the part of your question. I believe that we as Youth Initiative for Human Rights and a group of activists from formal or non-formal groups, we had always tested the freedom of assembly successfully. Okay. The fact that the results of those tests were negative, it's a clear indicator for the society and for many others what needs to be done in Serbia if we want to keep the democracy in any kind of let's say, functional way. I would just like to do a short retrospective that Youth Initiative in the last 10 years, since the Serbian Progressive Party came into power from 2012, until now, 6 of our gatherings were banned, with the official ban by the authorities, which makes us the champions of this battle, I would say. I would not say unfortunately, because I believe that many things that we mentioned here as trends, I think that we are wrong. These trends are our realities. And that's not just happening in Serbia, it's happening all across Europe. And if we want to do something to counter it, we first have to admit it. So this is the first lesson from dealing with the past, which basically my field of expertise is that I learn. If you want to face a challenge or if you want to face the problem, then you have to properly name it. However scary it might look like at a certain period of time, or how many people might disagree with you or think that you are exaggerating. So I think that this honesty that we need to have is something that is in the core of activistic approach that Youth Initiative is doing, and actually something that can help us to understand better the role of the institutions, their inefficiency, or the level of injustice that they're actually subjecting their citizens to. How would I assess the behavior of the institutions? I would say I would assess it as oppressive. 6 of those gatherings, if we would have a closer look to the topics of the gatherings that were banned, 3 of them were actually Pride parades, 2 regular ones, and in 2022 Euro Pride, which usually is being mentioned as something that has been happened, but it happened in spite of the ban. It didn't happen because we had Euro Pride and activists were, you know, these shiny, happy people who were celebrating love. It happened in spite of the official ban. So basically, Youth Initiative was one of the organizers. Basically, people were on the street not knowing what will happen to them, because that is what is going on when you go out on the street in spite of the official ban of the gathering. But I still believe, and I would maybe get back to the very beginning of this panel, where you also mentioned strategies and things that we should explore in order how to counter these trends. Definitely civic disobedience, because I think that relying on certain things, law or countries, if we're mentioning that this trend is being shared all around Europe, I think that civic disobedience is the only thing that we're being left with if we want to keep our democracy healthy. And I believe that many things that would happen in the streets in 2015 are unimaginable to happen in the street now. This day, while I was preparing for this panel in my office, one activist was detained. And while I arrived here, 4 of them were taken to prison in a police car. I was watching that video. So this is the country in which we are sitting and discussing freedom of assembly, freedom of expression. This is what is going on. And Milena briefly mentioned the statement of the Ministry of Interior, which basically said that everything that we witnessed in the last more than 2 weeks, actually, will just keep on happening. And this is the message, actually, that we got. So basically, who will manage to stay longer in this fight is the question, actually, that we have, and how we plan to do it. Maybe I would stop here, since maybe we have more things to discuss, and then to include the audience.
Thank you, Sofia. Yeah.
Maybe some food for thought.
I'm even thinking of maybe including the audience now if there is a question, but if not, we can proceed with another set of, yeah. Okay, we will proceed then. But Mr. Voule, we basically heard that mainly the biggest issue happens with the police and the law enforcement. And during your mandate as a UN Special Rapporteur, the institution has prepared the model protocol for law enforcement officials to promote and protect human rights in the context of peaceful protests. And how do you see the model being implemented? And do you think that the model can be implemented in the, you also mentioned, the authoritarian atmosphere and in sort of hybrid regimes where the institutions are already captured?
Well, thank you very much. I think what we hear, listen to all the panelists, we should tell ourselves that it's really worrying. What we are living, the time we are living now, with the democratic black sliding, but also what we are seeing around, because we all today are concerned about what is happening around the world. We are concerned about what is happening in our country. No state cannot tell us what will be our future tomorrow. So the only way that citizens can be able also to participate is to convey their message, to convey their concern. And this is exactly what peaceful protest is doing. But let me say that the behavior of the law enforcement is key in the protecting this fundamental freedom, but also in protecting democracy. In a country where law enforcement do not understand that peaceful protest is a fundamental freedom, that is a channel between citizens and their leaders to build a better future and to be able also to convey the message on what they want for their future, then you are living in a society where the civic participation, as I mentioned, do not exist anymore. In 2022, understanding all of this concern, the Human Rights Council asked my mandate to prepare a toolkit for law enforcement and how to protect fundamental freedom during peaceful protest. Because there are, the previous report that I present to the Human Rights Council show clearly that every year we have at least 100 of the people killed or injured because just they went to the street to protest. They want to exercise democratic rights. And this model protocol that was prepared with law enforcement, with all regional mechanisms, civil society, and we take all of the law enforcement from all of the region in Europe here, in Vienna. This model protocol take all the concern. What is the concern about the law enforcement when they are sent to protect assembly? What is the concern of the citizen? So we look at all of this concern and prepare the document, which is called today Model Protocol for law enforcement on how to facilitate. And this model protocol takes on the international standard, but also ongoing practice, ongoing good practice around law enforcement. And the model protocol first, the principle that the foundation of the model protocol is that peaceful protests do not need to be managed, do not need to be controlled. Peaceful protests need to be facilitated. And the duty of the law enforcement is to help organizers to get their message through, or to get their message to which authority they want to get their message. The second aspect is also that peaceful protests, as a democratic rights, need, for example, a certain level of understanding from the society that these rights can be exercised. In some cases, we may say that, okay, people are walking around the bridge. We are not able to go on time on our offices. Is that enough to say that we should not accept protests? Is that enough to tell people that you should not express your view because I want to be on time in my office? So we need, as in democratic society, to accept certain level of disturbance, because that's how democracy functions also. And then another aspect also is that within the peaceful protest, it's important that the model protocol, the principle that we saw, that the excessive use of force is against peaceful protest, the nature of these rights fundamental. So what the model protocol is doing is to give now new type of technique for law enforcement. That is important whenever people want to organize peaceful protests. It's important for law enforcement to discuss with organizer, to understand the organizer objective, to understand what is about this peaceful protest. It's also important also whenever during the peaceful protest, there are situations or there are tensions that emerge, law enforcement to be trained and to be equipped in desescalation technique and the negotiation technique. Because the fact that we see in most of the cases, whenever, for example, there are people within the protest that start being really shaking their hand and everything, law enforcement use force usually is the consequences of what we are seeing today, where people are repressed and people coming to join the protest and they don't know if they will go back at home. So the model protocol focuses on desescalation, it's focused on technique of really getting the tension down and negotiating, but also the model protocol also focuses on accountability. That accountability is not only the law enforcement, that the police officer that is on the ground, but it's who also gives the order. Is it the Ministry of Interior that gives the order to law enforcement? Is it this order in line with law? Is it this order in line with the international standard? So accountability that will be extended to the chain of the commander. And then also another aspect also is that the model protocol also take into account the fact that we have also today minorities, women protesting, and law enforcement cannot use the same technique as when they are peaceful in the protest. And they need also, when is needed, to use a technique that take into account the vulnerability, the minorities, and also the women in particular when they protest. For example, when they want, for example, to search, or they want also to be able to discuss, they need also to take all of these techniques. And the model protocol, I will end there, is divided in three parts. The first part is before the protest. What is the duty of law enforcement before the protest? The one key is to be able to gather information, but also to discuss with organizer, to understand the protest. And during the protest also, the second phase is during the protest. What is the duty of law enforcement? Their duty is also to use the technique of desescalation, to be able also, when there is a situation where minimum force need to be used, to ensure that there is use of least lethal weapon in accordance with international standard, but not the use of force. And also the last phase is after the protest. How law enforcement should ensure also that they are accountable. If you send the police officer on the site, and when they come back, you need to check the weapon. What was used as ammunition? What happened? Video, you need to record all of this for the accountability process. You need also to be able also to discuss and to debrief, to know how this experience worked well. And what I will end also is that the model protocol, because it was drafted with law enforcement, and it takes account in the law enforcement well-being, because one part of the model protocol is saying that law enforcement is important also to ensure that law enforcement well-being. If you send people that are not well, or people that are concerned, anxious, or mental issue, then you are creating the situation of repression. So it is important, because it was developed with them, many law enforcement around the world today are also asking to be able to look at the protocol to implement them. So this is also what I will say, because the protocol is not creating a new type of standard. It's just taking the existing standard and apply them in a specific context of the peaceful protest to ensure that we can also make our law enforcement friendly or human rights oriented people, because they are important also to protect our rights.
Thank you. And you mentioned something, and this is how the policing of the protests actually is affecting different minority groups maybe differently. So I would like to maybe turn to Jelena. You mentioned different kind of trends, But I would like to know whether you noticed any kind of specific way that these hybrid regimes, especially throughout the region, are targeting women human rights defenders, maybe differently than in general. And what would be the examples of resilience and solidarity between the activists in this challengeable environment?
Definitely. I would say that women human rights defenders tend to face very complex and different array of challenges themselves. First, I would say is that across Europe we have a strengthening anti-gender movement. And anti-gender narratives. And it's something that used to be on the fringe of society, but has increasingly moved into the mainstream. And in European countries are at best either ignoring or tolerating it, and at worst, entirely embracing it and using for political purposes. And just by virtue of doing so, the issues of gender are usually represented or advocated for by women, which means that the environment and the space for women human rights defenders is just by virtue of this whole movement is becoming increasingly smaller and more restricted. And in fact, we have even governments, especially here in the region, enacting laws that ban advocating on some of these issues. So, for instance, at the end of August, beginning of September, Bulgaria has passed a slew of legislation which has banned, for instance, passing information on non-traditional marriages, or what they call is spreading gay propaganda. So just having to face restrictions of that kind is already reducing space for women human rights defenders. But then the second issue is the fact that women activists tend to face different kind of threats. Obviously, the physical threats still exist, the threats of physical assault, property destruction, misogynistic messages on above the apartments where they live or their offices and similar. All this still exists. But a lot of this violence has moved on to online into digital sphere. And we are seeing online space becoming a huge threat for women human rights defenders. Most of the threats that women face online are usually sexualized and gendered. These are threats of sexual violence or sexually explicit images and similar. And in fact, Amnesty published a report a few years ago called Toxic Twitter, which looked at basically trends of women users on Twitter, and especially women of color, and how differently they're treated from male users. And it was a phenomenal difference because women users of Twitter faced incredible amount of violence, which is all gendered and directed against their identity. And but apart from that, Jovana, you asked about some of the examples of solidarity. So not to end on this, I do think that the right to protest is still, I mean, the protests are quite strong, and there are so many good examples of resilience and solidarity across the region in particular. Over the past few years, I don't think there was a single European country where women were not protesting against domestic violence and femicide. All of this led to some countries enacting legislation which criminalized femicide or passed or increased the stricter penalties for crimes and similar. And just a couple of good examples of solidarity among women are Saturday Night Mothers in Turkey, who continue for 30 years despite all the violence, protesting, seeking truth and justice for the disappeared, and even much closer to home, Women in Black here, who have defied nationalism for the past 30 years as well.
Thank you, and thank you for these local examples that we have been sort of cherishing for long years, and these are probably the most attacked human rights defenders here. I would like quickly to finish this round with again message for the Serbian citizens and the human rights defenders. Maybe from Milena, I would like to, well, we said that we are facing the deterioration of the situation in Serbia, and it doesn't look like it's going to stop very soon. So how can the legal community and actually people providing legal aid better support or prepare people who want to use their right to protest?
Okay, thank you for that question. First of all, I think we should encourage strongly grassroots movements, because I see only light on the end of the tunnel I see in grassroots movements. We should support them with free legal aid, with legal information on their right, and help them. Right now, we see one of the most subversive actions in Novi Sad, where opposition PAs are protesting in front of the building of the court, and they are symbolically taking back court and prosecutors. There are activists in pre-trial detention because of that court and that prosecutor's office, and they are showing their protest there, stopping everyone to enter into building. We see unrest there, and I think it is important because there are not always legal answers. Sometimes you need to encourage people to be brave, to ask, to request what is theirs, and the institutions belong to citizens. So what we can do as formal organizations, we can provide free legal aid, we can provide information, we can provide them all help we can to make them safe, to create some safe space for them. But you cannot stand and take it. You have to fight back. And I think it is really important that people are fighting back now.
Thank you. And finally, we are seeing a lot of youth in these protests. And we are not used to that. This is like the newer trend that we are seeing, which is a good development. And I was wondering on what would be the suggestion on how the civil society can actually straighten the support for their activities.
On multiple ways. I think that civil society has a lot of lessons to share with them, in particular when it comes to the band gatherings. And in the very beginning, it was mentioned actually that that usually the governments are not making this distinction between the far-right groups and the human rights activist groups. And that is a huge problem in Serbia, because all gatherings that Youth Initiative was organizing were banned for the security reasons, but actually because of 100 hooligans with whom basically state sided by choosing to defend their right to express their opinion, and they can move actually us from the public spaces. Regardless of whether it was a protest for LGBTIQ rights, a commemoration event, public commemoration for the crimes that were committed, or if it was a cultural festival between Kosovo and Serbia. So I think that there are a lot of things that we can share and a lot of knowledge that we can learn, especially in the field of strategic litigation, and we can provide them a lot of help, in a way, legal help. We can provide them with advices, because at least in organizations such as Youth Initiative, there is a lot of knowledge gathered, activistic knowledge on how to protect yourself in there when you are on the protest, when police is chasing you, or what are the other strategies on how you can also protest smartly in a way. But I also think that these young people, at least that's my experience, that we also have a lot to learn from them, because they're completely like tech savvy, and they know how to protect themselves in the digital world. And they learned one very important lesson, and that is to pick their battles and to strategize. And this is why I'm very actually proud of them, and I hope that also other organizations will be there at their disposal, because I believe that that is also our job.
It is definitely a vital interest. I'm opening a floor for questions. I see one there.
Hello. I'm Jelena, I'm also from Serbia, so we have to focus again, maybe. I'm looking forward to reading the Amnesty International report, but unfortunately, as already said in the panel, the situation is quite deteriorating since I imagine then. And I would just ask about practice or maybe examples, or that you can help us in two things that are related to the kind of deterioration of situations since 2023. First is the usage of the non-uniformed policemen at the protest. What are the, like when you talk about the toolkit related to the police officers, police force, we have almost, I would say, masked representatives of the police that are arresting protesters. And the second one is the more and more prominent usage of the security intelligence agency. How do we translate, Bia? Is that?
Yes.
So, yeah, more and more actually protesters are being brought to discussions, interviews by the security intelligence agency. So I was just wondering about maybe the examples of this practice in other countries, or is that also covered with the law enforcement, or this is kind of a little bit extravagance from our side again?
I would like to collect another question and then we can answer them. I think behind, no? No, I thought there was a hand behind Jelena. Okay, so Mr. Voule, would you like to try to answer the question?
I thought the question was for Jelena.
It was also for Jelena, but
Yes.
I would.
Yes.
I think this was directed towards the toolkit.
Yes, during the process of the consultations that we had, which lead to the development of these toolkits, one being model protocol, but also the use of digital means by law enforcement in the context of peaceful protests. So we have several of them, several components of this model protocol. Many law enforcement, for example, argue that it's important for them to be in civilian clothes to be able to protect protesters. Well, but we know that from the experience that we receive in most of the cases, law enforcement not being clearly identified can also lead to the lack of accountability. This is how model protocol is emphasized on that. That is important for law enforcement to be clearly identified. And you may, in some circumstances, have discussion with organizer, and knowing that there are a group of protesters or group of people that want to destroy the protest. And then you will have also to communicate with them, the organizer, with the phone, where they can contact you if they know that somebody or a group is within the protest. But not wearing the uniform sometimes can be identified, because none of organizer will know that it's a law enforcement. And how do you know when you are called by someone that is not identifiable, asking you a question? And also the second aspect also, the collection of intelligence is important for law enforcement from what they told us. If this collection aim, for example, to understand better what are groups, because this is what we are seeing, what are the groups that are likely to counter the protester or to go in the protest and create violence, then is a way for law enforcement to protect. But if this intelligence is about to prevent the protest, because this is what we have been seeing, that collection of this intelligence sometimes, even the protest will not happen. People are not outside. People will be called, even arrested from their home. And we are saying that this is against peaceful protest, is against. And that's why the model protocol is clearly saying this, that in order for this model protocol to be implemented, it's important, the political will. Government need to commit it that they want to create a space, because we know that protests will be increasing, because we are living in the world, we are living in a society where every day we are facing challenges. And it's the only tool for people to communicate, the only tool for people to also say that this is how we want you as a government to implement policy in order for us to deal with some of the challenges we are facing. And the best way for government is to create a legal condition where people understand that we can protest, but we can protest peacefully. But if there are a legal framework that is already restrictive, which, for example, many of the protesters understand that they will never fulfill the notification regime. For example, some of the countries for the notification regime require organizers to give so many information that they are not able to meet some of this information. Then you are creating incentive for people also to go to protest without even informing law enforcement or without even giving law enforcement someone in terms of how they can be protected. So I think that in your specific question, accountability requested that law enforcement should be clearly identified in order to also prevent any incentive for law enforcement, for example, and even the model protocol also mention also that whenever your name tag is there, it's not the one that you can take out and then after take it back. And body camera also today are important in order both for law enforcement themselves. When they are accused to behavior wrongly, they can also use their body camera and say, no, in this circumstance, they have been violent. This is how we use this. But also for the accountability purpose.
Thank you. If there is no more questions, I would like to thank you all. And I would like us to basically send the message that everyone has the right to a free protest, so a free assembly, and should not be deterred or afraid to use it. And we will need more and more people being more brave and in the streets, especially in order to take the institutions back to the people. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.